Hello and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. Recently I did a video talking about somebody and their clever idea of taking a non-restricted firearm, driving it to the range, switching it to a restricted configuration, which is how they wanted to shoot it, shooting it, and then switching it back to non-restricted and driving it home. They were hoping to, by doing it that way, to avoid needs for registration as well as authorizations to transport and all of that sort of thing. And I pointed out that there's some problems with that idea. It could theoretically end up sending you to jail. So I got some interesting follow-up questions on that. One is, what happens if you do it the other way, where you've got a restricted firearm and then you decide you want to take that hunting, and certain firearms you might be able to rearrange to a non-restricted configuration. So the idea would be you take your restricted firearm, you change it so that it's now non-restricted, you take it out hunting, you bring it back once you're done, you change it back to the restricted configuration. Can you do that, and what sort of laws are you going to run into? So that was one question. The other question was, people said, wait a minute, don't I have to report any changes within 30 days? Or sometimes they phrased it as, wait a minute, don't I have a 30-day sort of grace period? So that's sort of the second question. Now, a third question is not something anyone asked. It's something that I kind of clued in on while I was digging into this. And that is that there is a Section 74 tie-in. And honestly, I feel bad for not spotting this earlier, because I think it's a really big deal. This is a really exciting kind of thing to find out, because I think it really blows a hole in some of the registrar's arguments here. And when I say I regret not finding this earlier, I think that this is something that I want to share with you guys in case there's people still locked in these battles. This, I think, is a bit of a big deal. So let's go into this. The relevant portion here is actually part of the Firearm Registration Certificates regulations. So these are regulations that affect how firearm registration certificates are issued and so forth. And the key section here is Section 4, so conditions. And it notes, subject to Section 5, which we don't need to worry about here. It's a very sort of niche scenario. The registrar shall attach to a registration certificate that is issued in respect of a firearm the condition that the holder of the certificate shall advise the registrar within 30 days after the modification of A, any modification to the firearm that results in a change of class of the firearm, so from restricted to prohibited, or restricted to non-restricted, or whatever. B, in the case of a firearm registered as a frame or receiver only, any modification that makes it capable of discharging ammunition. C, any modification to an altered automatic firearm. And D, any modification that results in the firearm ceasing to be a firearm. So that is... What that means is that these conditions are not built into the law generally. They apply to you because they're attached to conditions on registration certificates. So they're actually part of your registration certificate, and that's essentially where that requirement lives. So this 30-day provision doesn't apply when you're starting with a non-restricted firearm and changing it to a restricted firearm. However, that doesn't mean that you don't have to report it, because as I mentioned in the other video, once you've changed it to a restricted firearm, it has to be registered that second. So basically, before you make that change, you need to already be on the phone with the CFO, letting them know what's happening, or doing that ahead of time so that you can get that registered simultaneously, because any period where you have a restricted firearm without the registration for it, you are committing a criminal offense. Now, if you're going the other way, if you are taking a restricted firearm and changing it to a non-restricted firearm, then you will have 30 days in which to report that. And you have to report it even if you change it back. There is another provision here which notes that subject to subsection 5, they shall attach a condition that when the type, action, caliber, or gauge of the firearm is modified, that you have to advise the registrar of the modification. And that's if it's intended to be permanent within 30 days, or if it's not intended to be permanent, but you don't change it back within 30 days after it's made, without delay after that period. But in terms of the change of class, that just applies. You have to report it, even if you change it back. That's one of the conditions. Now, let's say you have this restricted firearm and you change it to a non-restricted firearm. At that point, all of the rules of non-restricted firearms apply to it. So you no longer need an authorization to transport for that firearm. You do have to report it sometime within the next 30 days. But let's say you change it to a non-restricted firearm, you go duck hunting, and afterwards you come back and you change it. What you'd have to do is call the CFO and say, so I have this firearm, I changed it to a non-restricted firearm, and then I changed it back. And they'd probably say, cool, thanks for telling us, we don't care, but this condition still requires you to do that. So that is something to, keep in mind. The other thing, however, is that in the meantime, that firearm will be in the system as a restricted firearm. So let's say you take your shotgun, which is a restricted style shotgun, and change it to a non-restricted configuration, go duck hunting, and you're stopped by the police. And let's say they run that serial number. Well, they may see that in their system as a restricted firearm, at which point they're going to ask you for your authorization to transport to take that shotgun duck hunting. And you're going to say, I don't have one. And you should expect that you will probably get arrested and charged and put on bail conditions that require you to give up your firearms and all of these things until that gets sorted out. I will tell you, it is almost assuredly cheaper to just buy yourself another non-restricted shotgun and use that one instead. So it is theoretically possible. It is not a great idea. So all of that sort of taken care of. You might be wondering, why is Runkle excited about this? What is the interesting bit about this? And he said this ties into Section 74 hearings. How does that work? So let me sort of walk you through that one, because I think this is one of those things that has me excited as a law nerd and as a firearm law nerd. And I think it's actually a really strong argument. I think this is kind of the pocket aces on this one in some ways. I'm going to try to keep this simple. It's a bit of a complicated argument, but I'm going to try to simplify it down as much as I can. Let me know in the comments below if I got that right, or if maybe it's not super clear. But these conditions are, as mentioned, attached to a registration certificate. So they live on the registration certificate and only exist as long as that registration does. What that means in this context is the registrar has argued in their Section 74 filings that when a firearm changes classification from restricted to non-restricted or restricted to prohibited, something along those lines, that the registration certificate is automatically nullified. Well, let's stop and think about what that would do. So let's say we're looking at these conditions where you have to report a modification of the firearm that results in a change of class of the firearm. If you have a restricted firearm and you change it to non-restricted, if we accept the registrar's nullification argument, then the registration certificate becomes automatically nullified by that change. At which point the requirement to notify the registrar goes away. That clearly can't be the intention of Parliament here, because the whole purpose of this section is specifically to make sure that people do notify the registrar if they change the classification of the firearm. But that would be impossible to actually make work if that change canceled the registration certificate. Because let's say you had a shotgun which was a restricted shotgun, and then you decided, you know what, I'm just going to go a little step further and I'm going to saw the barrel off and turn this into a prohibited shotgun. This condition says that you should have to report that to the registrar, and of course the registrar would have strong opinions on you doing that. Do not do this. Do not saw off your shotguns. That is not a great move. But the registrar's interpretation here of saying, well, it automatically nullifies the registration certificate, actually eliminates that requirement that's on the conditions. So it seems to me that this clearly and specifically shows that the intention of Parliament was that registration certificates would persist until and unless they were revoked or canceled. So in the case of taking a restricted firearm and changing it to a non-restricted firearm, they would then say, okay, well, now we're going to revoke your certificate because it doesn't apply. You no longer need to have a registration certificate because this is now a non-restricted firearm, so we're going to revoke it for that reason. If you change it to a prohibited firearm and you didn't have authorization, you weren't entitled to possess prohibited firearms, they would say, we are revoking your registration certificate for this because you can't have it. And we're going to send some very burly people to your door in order to claim your firearm and probably all of your other firearms and probably you as well. But this clearly shows that that's what the idea of the law was, that you'd have to report it, not, hey, I changed it to non-restricted and now I don't have to report it anymore because that condition went away. This is my favorite kind of legal argument because it forces the opposing side to pick between two bad outcomes. If you're giving the other side a choice, you don't want to be saying, listen, do you want to choose the steak or the shit sandwich? Because they'll take the steak every time and that doesn't really benefit you. You want to be in a position where you can say, listen, you either have to choose the shit sandwich or the shit soup. And that way you can force them to choose between equally unpalatable outcomes. That's really what this argument does. It says, listen, either the change in classification automatically nullifies the registration certificate, which has been the position of the registrar thus far, in which case this section has a really big hole in it. And I don't think they want that hole. I don't think they want that hole to exist. I think that would be a big problem for them. But if they say, okay, well, the registration certificate persists, that guts their argument that they've been relying on for these Section 74 jurisdiction questions. So I'm entirely fine with them having to pick between those two options, and I think that's a perfectly acceptable place for them to have to be. Anyway, I thought about sort of keeping this one to myself and just saving it and dropping it only when I send in my written submissions, but I thought it was more important that I share this particular sort of idea and this particular argument because there's other people who might be involved in these hearings and might benefit from them. So as much as I'm sort of tempted to play, dragon sitting on the hoard of treasure and not mentioning this, I don't think this is a situation where they're going to be better able to prepare for it because, of course, all of this is going to involve written submissions and, they're going to have some time to think about it when they respond anyway. But there's more people involved in this fight than just me. So I want to make sure that when we find something that's useful here, that more than just me has access to it. So that was kind of my thinking there. Yeah. Thank you for watching. I want to, I really wanted to share this one with you. I think it's a big deal. So please like this video. Please share it with your friends. Subscribe to see more content. I also want to thank my Patreon supporters who make stuff like this possible. That being at the $50 level, Sir Daniel Wicks of Alberta, Jason Elliott, Canada's National Firearms Association, North Central Process Service, Kyle Martin, Jean-Guy Toussaint, and the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. At the $30 level, Sights and Arms Limited, and at the $20 level, Dale Nesbitt, Cameron Johnson, and Andrew Elsich, as well as all of you in the $10 level who will be in the crawl immediately following. Thank you once again. Really do appreciate it. This is one of those things that once I sort of saw it, I went, huh, and kind of got excited. This is a fun one to play with, and maybe I'm just a giant law nerd, but this has got me kind of amped up. I might have trouble sleeping tonight. So thank you for watching, and I hope this is armed with knowledge.